What is up, everyone? Welcome into another edition of our NBA DFS DraftKings Picks podcast. This time it is for Tuesday, November 30th, the last set of games in November. I'm your host, Justin Bales, and we have a decent 5-game slate after, I believe, 9 games last night on Monday. But 5 games isn't really that bad of a slate for a Tuesday. A lot of interesting stuff going on, but at the same time, it's still only 5 games, so it's not like there's all that much news that we have to go over. There is quite a bit. Obviously, you have stars like Ja Morant out. He's going to miss some time. But before we get started, if you enjoy this video or all of our content at dfskarma.com, go ahead and give us a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel. You can comment anything that you have below, questions, comments, just anything, and I will be there to respond throughout the day. But I believe we can more or less get into the slate. I guess the last thing that I'll mention is that we do have quite a bit of free content at dfskarma.com, or you can also find our core plays there, dfskarma.com/pricing. You can get in our free Discord, which also you do get premium channels when you pick up a core plays package. That is chatdfs.com. All of this can be found in the description below. The big thing that I will point out is that I believe it is the last day that you can get our 25% off promo. So you will get 25% off whatever package, core plays package you purchase. MVP, NBA, NFL, props, college football, or college basketball. All of them get 25% off using the promo code TURKEY. And it's for the first purchase of the package that you buy. So if you buy a month, you get 25% off the month. A week only gets the week. So the longer you do, the more money you get off of it. But we can get into the slate tonight. I will start with the injury news. We actually have quite a bit for it only being a 5-game slate. As I mentioned, Ja Morant are already ruled out. He's going to be out for quite a bit of time. OG Anunoby is out for, I believe, at least 3 more games. Khem Birch has been ruled out tonight, and Gary Trent Jr. is questionable. For New York, not injury news, but we have learned that Kemba Walker has essentially been benched. He's out of the rotation. Alec Burks will start at point guard. Then in terms of specific injury, because there is also a lot going on here, RJ Barrett, Taj Gibson, Derrick Rose, and Nerlens Noel all questionable. On the other side of that game, Nicholas Claxton will continue to miss time for Brooklyn. For the Lakers, you have LeBron James is questionable, also Avery Bradley, but James is obviously the big one here. On the other side, Rashawn Holmes is off the injury report. Harrison Barnes still doubtful. Mo Harkless is at questionable for tonight as well. For Detroit, Killian Hayes back. Frank Jackson is questionable. And then on the other side, Norman Powell is essentially questionable. It looks like he might actually be closer to out than in, but plenty of stuff can change throughout the day. So Norman Powell is questionable for the Portland Blazers. Draymond Green has been taken off the injury report for Golden State. Damian Lee, Andre Iguodala, both already ruled out, and then Abdel Nader, not that it matters all that much, but he has also been ruled out for Phoenix on the other side of that game. As always, I'm going to try to keep my pool relatively tight. This will probably be a shorter podcast with only 5 games, but I'll try to keep the podcast pool relatively tight because then I also will have the game theory article be posted, and then we'll be talking about stuff all day in Discord. So if you have any questions on any players whatsoever, drop them in the comments. I'll let you know what I think. Just because I don't necessarily mention a player or talk about them doesn't mean that I don't believe they're a good play. It just means that they didn't make this particular podcast pool. So starting at point guard, I guess if you want to spend up on guys, I have no problems with that. Russell Westbrook is probably the guy that stands out the most, specifically if LeBron James sits. If James is in, I don't necessarily think you need to play Westbrook, even though I do believe that with this small of a slate, only 5 games, he is viable at 10-8. But if LeBron James sits, Russell Westbrook will kind of skyrocket into one of the better plays. I like going down to De'Aaron Fox, who will be on the other side of that game. He only played 21 minutes in his last game. It was a complete blowout against the Memphis Grizzlies. Scored 25 fantasy points, but the big thing is the Los Angeles Lakers have really struggled against point guards throughout the season. In Their only matchup so far, he scored 54.5 fantasy points. Granted, I believe that went to triple overtime. He did play 53 minutes, but 32 shot attempts in that game, along with 6 rebounds, 8 assists. So you just kind of see that the potential is 100% there. So I do like De'Aaron Fox quite a bit against the Lakers, especially since his price tag is only at 8,400 at the moment. As you continue down a little bit, I think you probably jump to the Memphis guys, Tyus Jones and DeAnthony Melton. I'm assuming at this point in the season, people aren't crazy enough to move off of guys from previous games, but some might. And Memphis really blew out the Kings in essentially their first game without Ja Morant, which led to really limited minutes for guys like DeAnthony Melton, guys like Tyus Jones. They just didn't see massive minutes in that game. That doesn't mean that they're not going to moving forward. I think that's a pretty big thing. You can also just dump Desmond Bane in here as well. He's point guard eligible now on DraftKings, but all three of them completely in play against Toronto. I'm not overly concerned. I feel like their minutes are going to get back up there when they're not winning by almost 30 points against a relatively bad team. But they do get a matchup against Toronto, which I like. So I have no problems whatsoever if you want to use any of them. As you move down a bit more, the cheap guy that I've kind of been gravitating towards just because of his pure upside is Cameron Payne. I mean, he gets essentially 20 minutes and he comes with 30 plus fantasy point upside. It's generally not something you see for as cheap as he is. I guess more of a safer option, I would say, after he returned in his last game, played bigger minutes, would be Killian Hayes at 4,200. But Hayes just doesn't have the pure upside that someone like Payne does. So I probably prefer Payne in tournaments, whereas I don't necessarily want to use Hayes in cash games, but I understand it because he's cheap and should get the minutes. As you move to shooting guard, there's not necessarily all that much that stands out as great options. I think up at the top, the Toronto-Memphis game is going to be a good one to attack, and Fred VanVleet's only 8,700, so that's probably where I look essentially at the top of this. As you move down, though, more, I think it's pretty clear-cut that people are going to play Alec Burks. He has been named the starting point guard. He played 39 minutes in their last game, 40 fantasy points. We know that when he gets the time on the floor, he can score fantasy points in a hurry, and it looks like Burks should essentially be locked into 30-plus minutes as the starting point guard. So at 5,600, it's not going to be, or his price tag isn't going to be that low for very long. It should skyrocket and pretty fast. But for the time being, it's pretty clear-cut that at shooting guard, that's who you're using. Outside of that, you have guys like DeAnthony Melton. I'm not going to go over anyone that we already discussed at point guard specifically. I do think that they're all in play, obviously, if they also have shooting guard eligibility. But if LeBron James is out, Talen Horton-Tucker, I do believe makes a good option. He can be used in tournaments if James is in, just because he still has a relatively solid role. He scored 30.5 fantasy points in his last game, and he's still under 5,000. I wouldn't expect that to continue to happen all that often, but at least the upside's there. I just prefer if LeBron's out, that's just a really good spot to go. Moving to small forward, I have no issues with the top guys, but you probably won't end up on Kevin Durant. You probably don't really end up on LeBron James, even though I do think that both of them are viable. Probably just drop down a little bit. At 7,000, it's tough to really move off of Dillon Brooks at the moment. If you look at his last two games, he's played 21 and 19 minutes. Both of them blowouts. They got absolutely destroyed by the Atlanta Hawks, and then they absolutely destroyed the Sacramento Kings. The big thing is, in 21 and 19 minutes, he took 17 and 15 shots. Those were both essentially games without Ja Morant. The game against Sacramento, completely without Morant, and the game against Atlanta, he got hurt. I believe he played like 9 minutes in the game or something. So it looks like Dillon Brooks is going to have a very, very big role. Obviously gets a solid matchup against Toronto. He already played well against them, scored almost 30 fantasy points in 26 minutes. The big issue, I guess, here is that we're not really getting him at a discount. We saw his price tag kind of bump up quite a bit. He was 6,100 against Sacramento. He's now 7,000. But it's just a really good spot for him. And I feel like it's a relatively easy play that I'll probably end up actually making tonight. As you look at small forward, if Norman Powell is out, I probably drop down to Nasir Little. Tony Snell got the start last night, but Nasir Little actually started the second half. Kind of weird that he didn't just start the game, especially because he's actually been playing well when given the minutes. But he gets a solid matchup against Detroit. It's not a defense that I'm overly concerned with. 3,500, as long as he's getting 25 plus minutes, Nasir Little is a really good option for really cheap at small forward. The other thing that I think should be mentioned, DeAndre Bembry and Bruce Brown are in this weird thing. I know the other night I actually played Bruce Brown when he played 4 minutes. Bembry obviously paid 35. He was just on fire from, essentially the entire game. He scored 35 fantasy points, which isn't really something that Bembry generally does. But just keep an eye out for which one of those two is starting. If Bruce Brown happens to be starting, I do think that he's a really good play. I think that Bembry's fine, but Brown under 4,000 if he's starting, which essentially locks him into the minutes. I do think that that's one of the better salary relief options on this entire slate. At power forward, I think if you're spending closer to the top, the guy that I really do like is Pascal Siakam. I know he hasn't been overly great this season, but he's been significantly better at home. He gets a solid matchup against Memphis, and OG Anunoby is out, so Siakam's going to take on a very large role in their offense. So I do think that at 8,500, he's completely in play. As you move down a little bit, Jaren Jackson Jr. continues to be one of the most up and down players in the league, and it's essentially because his minutes are anything but consistent. His fouls kind of dictate what he does. So I do think that Jaren Jackson Jr. under 7,000 is in play because he has the ability to hit value or exceed value in, essentially the low 20s, mid 20s. And if he gets 30 plus minutes, he comes with 50 plus fantasy point upside. So I do think that Jaren Jackson is a very solid option for under 7,000. I just think that he comes with absolutely terrible downside as well. With Harrison Barnes out, this is kind of interesting. Richaun Holmes back is going to essentially take away anything from Alex Len. I think it also probably takes away from Marvin Bagley, whereas Chimezie Metu, I believe, probably still plays his minutes in the low to mid-20s. Mo Harkless could get some minutes as well. It's just kind of an odd spot. I think Metu probably is the guy that benefits the most, but I might just take the shot on someone like Richaun Holmes. So I'll keep this at power forward because I'm not necessarily sure where I want to go with Sacramento, especially if Mo Harkless is ruled in and Harrison Barnes is ruled out. I probably just move over to center there, but 4,100 Metu is, I suppose, in play. I don't necessarily love his game. But we've seen if he gets minutes in the mid-20s, he can produce, 30-plus fantasy points. And essentially, that would be more than okay for 4,100. You probably want a little bit over 20. So especially against the Lakers, who don't really have a defense that I'm overly scared of. The big problem is that you have guys like Robert Covington, who should be locked into the minutes, especially if Norman Powell's out, and he's under 4,000. I just prefer that as a play. Brandon Clark, again, under 4,000. 12 and 16 minutes in his last two, but he saw 26 in the ones before that. Even in the 16 minutes, he scored 26 fantasy points. So if you just get the odd, weird night where Brandon Clark's playing more minutes, his upside is unbelievable for only 3,700. And, that's probably just someone that I would much rather play versus someone like Metu or, you have Nasir Little here as well. So plenty of very solid options. As you move to center, I don't truly know what I want to do here. I think Rashawn Holmes is one of the better options. I would need to see if he's on any type of minutes restriction, but he only missed about a week, so I would assume not. And if he's getting 30 plus minutes, I think that's really good. LaMarcus Aldridge continues to play well. Not cheap anymore, but his minutes are up, and he's kind of been scoring 30 plus. So I do think that Aldridge is completely in play there. Another guy that you can consider is Isaiah Stewart, finally back from his 2-game suspension. I believe he returned a couple of games ago, and he gets a solid matchup against Portland. I have no issues there with Kelly Olynyk still out. He should be locked into pretty solid minutes. So that's the type of player that I would take there. And then Precious Achiuwa, I don't necessarily love him, but the minutes have been there. The upside is completely there. He gets a really good matchup against Memphis, who's struggled against centers throughout the season. My big concern is that Steven Adams is a relatively big guy. He's not playing a ton of minutes, and if they move Brandon Clark over to center, or even, I guess Jaren Jackson Jr. is probably a little bit too tall, has too much length for Achiuwa, but if they use someone like Brandon Clark at center, Achiuwa is going to make a really good option because that's the type of matchup that he can really excel in. Outside of that, guys that we've kind of already talked about as cheaper options that do come with quite a bit of upside that I feel are really good plays on this type of slate with only 5 games. But once again, that's about all we have. Once again here, you can use the promo code TURKEY to get 25% off of any package that you purchase. Highly recommend that. I believe this will be the last day that we are doing that, so jump on if you're doing that as well. You can find all of the links to everything you need, dfskarma.com, for our content, pricing for the core plays, our chat room. Everything is below in the description. Good luck, and I should be back on Wednesday for another podcast, but hopefully everyone hits pretty big tonight.